Good evening, welcome to Left, Right and Centre. First up, a Diwali gift from the government, and it couldn't have come a day later. The government has announced an excise duty cut on petrol and diesel, which will be reduced by 5 and 10 rupees respectively from tomorrow. The reduction in diesel certainly comes as a boost to farmers during the upcoming Rabi season. States have also been urged to reduce VAT on petrol and diesel, which have seen record highs in the last several days. But the big story this evening, in addition, of course, to what you saw just there, Covaxin has become the first indigenous vaccine to get World Health Organization emergency use authorization. A huge step which comes after months of negotiations, but there are still some concerns. More data is needed on the safety of the vaccine in pregnant women. Now, the World Health Organization clearance is huge, not only as an enabler for the export of the vaccine, but also for the travels of Indian citizens who have received Covaxin but were not considered vaccinated. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, the Chief Scientist of the World Health Organization, joins me in a moment. Vishnu, how would you react to this development as far as Covaxin is concerned, considering it's been such a long period of time?
Well, I think this is excellent news. It's especially coming on at the time of Diwali. So it's very welcome news. Obviously, we were anxiously awaiting this approval for a long time. And to respond to your question, I do believe that all these vaccines have been developed at warp speed, and there's been rolling reviews that have taken place across the vaccine ecosystem. So I think basically you must understand that WHO, I'm sure, follows very stringent guidelines, and a lot of data that is required to complete dossiers and to complete the review requires submission of data points which have been submitted, based on which I think it's very important that they have received this emergency use approval, which is very welcome news. Yes, I think they need more data to approve other indications, such as the use of vaccine, Covaxin for pregnant women, and perhaps later on for children. But I think the fact that it can be used on adults itself is very, very important news.
It is indeed. In fact, we've got Dr. Soumya Swaminathan back with us. I just want to go across to her, and I'll come back to you in a moment. Dr. Swaminathan, the independence of this entire process and how it is extremely, extremely rigorous. Could you tell us about, the qualifications of some of the people who've gone through the data for several months and why they felt that they needed this back and forth to get more data?
Thank you for that question, Vishnu. Understandably, a lot of people were very impatient to receive the emergency use listing from WHO. I'm very glad that it's happened today. But let me first tell you about the process, and also to highlight that this vaccine is not one that's taken longer than others. In fact, there are other vaccines on the list. The WHO, as you know, has a rolling submission process, which started in November of last year. The first vaccines data was submitted in November of 2020. And on average, it's taken 50 to 60 days from submission. But some vaccines, notably Sinopharm and Sinovac, took 150, 165 days. Others, like the Janssen vaccine, took about 40 days. Covaxin is somewhere in the middle. It took somewhere between 90 and 100 days. And the reason is that this expert advisory group, the Technical Advisory Group, or TAG, is made up of independent external experts who cut across disciplines from internal medicine, pharmacology, immunology, regulatory expertise, manufacturing expertise, and they actually review the data, the dossier, once the regulatory experts of WHO have identified all of the queries. So the dossier, putting together the dossier takes time. So Bharat Biotech started the rolling submission in the middle of July. And since then, there was a lot of back and forth. And the first meeting of the Technical Advisory Group took place last week. There were some additional clarifications they had asked. They had asked for more data from the clinical trials by gender, by age group. They had asked a few more questions on the manufacturing, particularly related to the adjuvant, as well as to the data on immunogenicity and reactogenicity. So some details also on the laboratory immune tests that were done. The committee met again today, and they were very satisfied with all of the responses to the additional questions that they had posed, and so they have approved it for lifting. So it's the 8th vaccine now to receive EUL. There are another 13 vaccines that are still awaiting emergency use listing.
Does that include Indian vaccines as well, a few others which are being developed in the country?
We have encouraged all the developers to submit on a rolling basis. So we are expecting a few more companies, but I think they're probably putting their dossiers together.
Right. Dr. Swaminathan, the WHO says, and I quote, available data on vaccination of pregnant women with the Covaxin vaccine are insufficient to assess vaccine safety or efficacy. How much of a concern is it? It sounds quite serious. And would you perhaps clear Covaxin for use on pregnant women if more data is submitted? Is that an expectation, more data?
So some subgroups are particularly, looked at, and that includes pregnant women. In this case, it also includes people over the age of 60, because we've observed with some of the other vaccines that there's not such a good immune response in that age group. And of course, it includes children below the age of 18. In all of these groups, you need to do specific studies to look for data both on safety and efficacy. As far as pregnant women are concerned, the company has plans to do a pregnancy sub-study and a pregnancy registry. Of course, they were not included in the clinical trial. Usually, pregnant women are not included in clinical trials. So what we do know, however, is that quite a large number of pregnant women in India have received Covaxin. And so there should be enough data. There is enough data on the safety. We have not seen any safety signals. What is still awaited is data on the newborns, because obviously one looks at both the mother and the baby when it comes to pregnancy outcomes. So these additional data have been requested. And what we can expect perhaps is from experience from other inactivated vaccines that it should not be an issue during pregnancy. So I don't think people should be concerned about the safety. And as soon as we are able to see that data documented from the program, the programmatic rollout, it should be possible to then also include that in the recommendations.
Dr. Swaminathan, will the WHO also be assessing Covaxin for use on children, because it's expected to roll out for kids in India?
Yes, we are expecting the data on children to be submitted. WHO has not received the data yet.
Any idea when that would come? Again, how long would that process take? Would it again be a matter of months for that to be assessed?
In this case, it should be much faster. But again, it depends really on the data. The same things happen with other companies, like the mRNA vaccines. They were first approved for adults, and then as data in younger and younger age groups became available, it was submitted. It is looked at again by both committees. As you know, we have SAGE, which does the policy guidance, and we also have this technical advisory group on the regulatory. But it should be much faster once the data are in.
Dr. Swaminathan, a final question to you. In simple terms, what does this mean for millions of Indians who've been vaccinated with Covaxin, and what does it mean for the drug itself in being exported around the world? The WHO and Gavi and COVAX, they need vaccines, right? I mean, it's a given at this stage. With your clearance, does this potentially mean large orders or exports of this drug so that it can go all over the world and help people?
Yes, it has very significant implications, Vishnu. On the travel, many countries accept WHO emergency use listed vaccines, because it's a stamp of safety, efficacy, and quality. So definitely, I think even though WHO says not to use vaccines as the exclusive sort of a passport for travel, but many countries are using vaccines to allow travel, and therefore this emergency use listing will allow this vaccine, Covaxin, to be listed on that list. That's the first. Second is that global procurement agencies, including UNICEF, Gavi, and the COVAX facility, depend on WHO emergency use listing for procurement. So if Bharat Biotech in India were wanting to supply COVAX, for example, for the world, then this is the first step. It should make it possible now to start those discussions. And the third thing is that regulatory agencies in other countries around the world accept WHO's EUL, and this really facilitates regulatory approval within within their own national borders, and therefore this vaccine can now be accepted in many more countries.
Thanks, Van. Thanks so much, Dr. Swami Swaminathan, for speaking to us. It's a great day, I think, for people around the world, not just in India, that another vaccine has come. A vaccine which, can save lives. It saved lives over here. Perhaps many more people around the world will benefit from it as well. I'm just going to go back to Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw. Ma'am, you were listening into that conversation, and I think it's interesting what Dr. Swaminathan mentioned when she actually said that, contrary to what a lot of people may believe, the time taken to clear Covaxin wasn't necessarily the longest. It was squarely in the middle. That a few of the Chinese vaccines actually took more time, not less time.
I think she's absolutely right. I think the review process follows certain norms, and I think they need certain data points, and I think that's what it is. And because these vaccines have been developed at such warp speed, it's a rolling review. So as they look at the data and they feel there is some missing data points, they request for more data. I think, as Dr. Swaminathan rightly said, I think we should not really overreact to the delay because we were impatient. But if you look at the review process which other vaccines have undertaken, I don't think it's very different.
Ms. Shaw, one of the key aspects of this particular vaccine is it has to be developed or manufactured in a level 3 biocontainment facility because of the nature of the vaccine itself. It's not an easy vaccine to make, but obviously with the WHO clearance, there is no doubt that it works very well. How important is safety of manufacture in a vaccine of this nature, where essentially the virus is inactivated and then subsequently injected?
Well, obviously, when WHO reviews dossiers, they look at, CMC, manufacturing processes, quality release systems. So I think all those are taken care of. But as you just heard, it is not that simple to make these kind of vaccines. Therefore, the kind of capacities that you can create from such vaccines are much smaller than other types of vaccines. So, right now, if you look at the present kind of capacities, I know that Serum Institute is producing upwards of 200 million doses a month. I understand that Bharat Biotech is trying to ramp up to about 50 million doses a month. And of course, you've got other companies like Zydus Cadila and, the Sputnik vaccine also adding to this. So right now we have over 300 million doses a month being produced by all the vaccine makers. But suffice to say that, it will be very difficult for Bharat Biotech to produce the kind of viral vector level capacities, because it is a difficult process. And therefore, I think the kind of capacity that we are talking about will be a little smaller, but pretty large in the scheme of things, because they have ramped up and, created new capacities. So that should actually give us more vaccine doses.
I don't know if, we've got more vaccines than, is required to be rolled out at this stage. The reason I ask is, as vaccine manufacture goes up, we should also start thinking of a booster dose. Now, the government's policy, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is that, look, we need to get as many people who haven't been vaccinated because capacity is low. But if capacity goes up, right, do you not believe that in the next few months, we should go in for booster doses, perhaps even giving people the option of buying or paying for a booster dose only if there is availability in the market?
So first and foremost, that we need to vaccinate about 65 to 70% of our population, eligible population, with a second dose. And I think that is something which we really need to focus on. And with the kind of capacities that we are generating, I don't think we will take more than a few months. So I'm very confident by the end of this year, or maybe at best January, you'll be able to vaccinate the entire population with 2 doses. So I think that would put us in a very safe spot. And thereafter, I think again we need to do a graded booster dose vaccination, starting with the most vulnerable, and then sort of bringing it to other levels. Because the moment you give 2 doses, Vishnu, you must understand that you're absolutely reducing the the incidence towards hospitalization and severe disease. So to that effect, I think the population is fairly well protected. But obviously you want not to take any chances, and therefore booster doses are recommended, because you don't want, if you want 0 breakthrough infections, then I think you want to give booster doses. And in any case, most of these these kind of viral diseases do sort of require annual shots,
sure,
like the flu shot.
Sure.
So I think you will start needing these kind of booster shots. But having said that, I think you must have heard what our Prime Minister mentioned, that we are going to be in a position to produce 5 billion doses per annum. And I think at that level, I think not only can we be very confident of being able to give booster doses to our population, but we can actually vaccinate a very large part of the world as well.
I think that's very much the future, but in the interim period, we've got our children to vaccinate, hopefully, and that's a separate conversation altogether. I'll catch you on that conversation, perhaps on another occasion. I'm running short on time. Thank you, ma'am. Always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed. Lots of comments on coup, as you might expect. Rajesh Kumar writes in, he says, big relief for students and working professionals who are planning to travel abroad without any hassles. Dipali Sinha says, a big achievement for India. Hope there will be no politics in on this. I think that's a big if, but it's a good day as far as Indian science is concerned. We're going to move on now to our next focus this evening, the big bi-poll results, the upsets and the gains. We're going to talk about what this actually means for the opposition. I'll be joined by the former Finance Minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram, in just a few moments from now. But a quick summary. In Himachal Pradesh, the Congress has won 3 Vidhan Sabha seats and the Mandi Lok Sabha seat. In West Bengal, 4 on 4 for the Trinamool Congress. In Madhya Pradesh, 2 Vidhan Sabha seats for the BJP, 1 for the Congress. And in the Northeast, big wins for the BJP, 9 wins for the BJP and their allies in the northeastern part of our country. Rajasthan, both Vidhan Sabha seats have gone to the Congress. In Haryana, the BJP has actually lost its deposit in Allahabad. In Bihar, the JDU has won both seats. Well, joining us now, the senior Congress leader, former Finance Minister, Mr. P. Chidambaram. Thanks, sir. Thanks, Mr. Chidambaram, very much for being with us. Would you accept that the larger trend that we've seen in these by-elections is that the ruling party of the state has been able to do rather well? So if you are in power in a state, this time around, chances are that you won.
Well, not necessarily. Himachal Pradesh, that's not true.
Right, that's true.
So Himachal Pradesh can't be called an exception. I think the larger picture, the larger lesson that one has to draw from these election results is that the non-BJP opposition has been able to share the honors with the BJP. As I tweeted, out of the 30 assembly seats, the BJP has won 7, its allies won 8, making it 15. So the Congress won 8, won more than the BJP, and the other non-BJP parties have 6. So I think with the first time we have drawn level with the BJP, despite their enormous money power, misuse of authority, etc. We have drawn level, drawn abreast with the BJP and its allies.
Mr. Chidambaram, would you agree that we might be getting ahead of ourselves if we were to suggest that these election results alone are indicative of people, let's say, turning against the BJP?
I entirely agree with you. It would be a wrong conclusion to say that we have got ahead of the BJP. That's why I'm very careful when I say we have drawn abreast with the BJP. And now, the next round of elections in 5 states gives us an opportunity to draw ahead.
Right. Mr. Chidambaram, I think this always comes back to one point. When one looks at a unified opposition in this country, the fact of the matter is it's not unified, not in the least. There's no one dominant opposition leader. So therefore, it's all very well to look at state assembly elections and the fact that opposition parties seem to be winning every now and again, quite frequently. But when one looks at a national election, the lack of a dominant single opposition leader, some would suggest, would mean that the BJP always has the edge.
You are right on every sentence of your statement except the last one.
I thought you might say that.
I thought you would say that.
The dominant single leader was certainly an advantage in 2014. But a dominant single leader dominating the polity, dominating the economy, dominating the thought process for 10 years could turn out to be a disadvantage also. Therefore, one has to wait to see what happens in 2024. As I said in my tweet, I'm not looking at 2024. I'm looking at 2022.
Right.
I agree. The BJP seems to have an advantage with a dominant single leader, but I'm afraid it could turn out to be a disadvantage.
So if you're looking at a flow from, you know, doing well in the next assembly elections going into 2024, another way of looking at it would be just 3 years till 2024. And by now the opposition should necessarily have been united, at least with a leader or a couple of leaders who project a unified face. How would you respond to those who say that it's already too late?
They will not be a united opposition in the sense that you are talking about. See, such an opposition, sort of artificially united, could fall apart. For example, the BJP has lost allies. It has lost the Akali Dal. It has lost the Shiv Sena. It was on the verge of losing the JDU. So who is BJP's ally today? For all we know, in 2024, the JDU can go its own way. And it may have crypto allies like the YSR Congress in Andhra Pradesh, sort of a reluctant ally in Odisha, Mr. Naveen Patnaik. But it may not have an ally in that sense. The Congress, on the other hand, is adding allies now. The Congress has the DMK on its side. It has the NCP and the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra. It is possible that some other regional parties may become the ally of the Congress by 2024. As I said, I'm not looking at 2024. I want the state government battles. I think there are 5 next year. And then in the end of the year, there are 2 or 3, and then there's some in 2023, but about 10 states are going to election. If in these states, either the Congress or some other regional party defeats the BJP, you will find then the momentum begins for a united non-BJP opposition.
It's interesting that you use the word momentum, Mr. Chidambaram, because if you talk about momentum, it certainly doesn't help the Congress that you shoot yourself in the foot in a state like Punjab, where you shoot yourself in the foot on a daily basis, it seems.
I'll comment on Punjab in a moment, but let us look closely at the data of the 30 assembly elections. In Himachal, the Congress's vote share was 48.9%, whereas BJP's was 28%. In Maharashtra, it was 57.03%, and the BJP's was 35.06%. In Rajasthan, it was 37.51%, and the BJP was 18.8%. The spread between the BJP and the Congress, when the Congress wins, is very large, close to 20% and more. But look at say, UP, Madhya Pradesh. BJP won 2 versus Congress has 1, but the BJP's vote share was 47.58. The Congress's vote share was 45.45. A spread of only 2%.
Right.
In Karnataka, the spread is only 7%. In Meghalaya, the spread is, in fact, in favor of the Congress by 2% against the opponent. So I think the spread is closing. The Congress is closing, and where it wins by a thumping margin. Where it loses by a small margin.
A narrow margin. Right.
Therefore, I think there is wind behind the sail of the Congress. That's all I can say now. I don't want to jump to conclusion. there seems to be a wind behind the sail of the Congress.
All right, Mr. Chidambaram, we'll see what actually happens off the wind behind the sail of the Congress. Talk about Punjab some other time. I'm afraid I'm completely out of time on this program. It's time for this short break.